Hello and welcome to Downtime Activities. I'm Matthew, and today I'm going to be doing another video in our Help Action series. A series of videos where I break down kind of nitty-gritty 5e rules and go into detail on how they work, how they should work, and how best you can use them. Today I'm going to be talking cover in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, which is a seemingly simple thing that a lot of people mess up and has a little bit more intricacy than you would think. Let's check it out. Alright, let's talk about cover in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. I'm going to start by going over the kind of base rules of how cover works. So cover, obviously, is something that protects a creature from an attack or an effect. For this to take effect, the source of that attack or effect has to obviously be on the opposite side of the cover. The cover has to be in between the person who's gaining cover and the effect or the attack that is coming at them. Also, an important note here is that cover doesn't stack if you have multiple sources. So if you're granted half cover by one thing and 3/4 cover by another thing, you don't get to have the bonuses of both of those applied. You just do whichever is the larger bonus, and that's the one you get. Speaking of half and 3/4 cover, there's technically 3 different types of cover you can have. Half cover, which will give you a +2 bonus to armor class and dexterity saving throws, and this is if an obstacle blocks at least half of your body, and this can be things like a low wall, large piece of furniture, narrow tree trunk, or a creature, whether that creature is an enemy or a friend, which is an important note as well. 3/4 cover, on the other hand, gives a +5 bonus to AC and dexterity saving throws, and similarly it's going to be if about 3/4 of the body is covered by an obstacle. And the examples that the book gives of this are things like a portcullis, an arrow slit, or a thick tree trunk. Total cover is the last kind, and it means that the target cannot be targeted directly by an attack or a spell. Although some spells can reach it by doing things like area of effects, it has total cover, it's completely concealed, it can't be the target of things like an arrow being shot at it. There are some effects that kind of change or twist cover. Feats like the sharpshooter or spell sniper feat will allow you to ignore all but total cover, and there is some spell effects or ranged attack effects with things like the arcane archer that can allow you to hit things that even have total cover, but for the sake of this, I'm not going to go into all those little niche rule cases. We're just going to talk the rules as written in an average case scenario. There is also an optional set of rules in the DMG that goes over cover getting hit that go kind of as follows. When a ranged attack misses a target that has cover, you'd be able to use this optional rule to determine whether that cover is struck instead by the attack. First, you'll determine whether the attack roll would have hit the protected target if it didn't have that cover bonus. If the attack roll falls within a range low enough to miss the target, but high enough to strike the target if there had been no cover, then instead that object that is being used for cover is struck. And at that point you would use the kind of hit points and things of that object, and potentially that cover could get destroyed. If a creature is providing that cover for the missed creature, and the attack roll exceeds the AC of the covering creature, that means that the covering creature would get hit instead. However, if that covering creature has a high AC, even if the attack misses its intended target but falls within that range where it's because they had cover, it doesn't just automatically get to hit that closer creature. If that closer creature's got a super high AC, they're still totally safe. Kind of pings off their armor or whatever. These are the 2 major kind of rule sets for cover. I'm going to start by just kind of discussing my opinion of cover, how best to use it, some cases that I think are good examples of how best to use or not to use it, and then I'll give my opinion on that optional rule right at the end. To start with, when discussing creatures being used as cover, I think that you should rarely allow a creature to provide more than half cover, but you should usually allow a creature to provide half cover. What I mean by this is, if there is a creature in a straight line between an intended target and the source of an attack or a spell, then you should totally let that intended target get that +2 bonus. However, in all but extreme cases, I would rarely give that like 3/4 cover based on a creature being in between. There's some examples where a particularly large creature really fills up that space, but for average, I would just keep it at that +2 bonus to avoid overuse and misuse. Also, something to take note of here is that if you're worried about your players kind of overusing this and kind of always getting that +2 bonus to AC for their squishy, high damage dealing backline. Just remember that in most cases, unless they're fighting in a tube, most of this can be countered by a simple 5-foot step to the right or left, getting that straight line moved out of the way, and meaning that they have a direct line of sight on the target with no cover. A really kind of complicated part of cover is area of effect spells, or area of effects in general. Area of effect spells often originate from a point of the caster's choosing, not from the caster themselves. This means that the origin is used for determining cover and should absolutely be taken into effect with spells like Fireball or Cone of Cold, and effects like breath weapons from dragons. This is something that you have to kind of the player has to be very mindful about. They have to choose where this origination point is with a spell like Fireball very particularly, and from there you can kind of trace out the lines for each of the creatures inside of that area of effect and make sure nothing's in the way. This can be a little tedious at times, but overall can be done fairly quickly. This will also allow for some really cool moments. Your players can kind of tuck behind pillars as a dragon's breath weapon is about to flow through the area and give themselves a much needed bonus on their dex saves. It's just something to keep in mind that doesn't matter who's casting the spell, it's where the spell source originates from. And similarly with that cone breath weapon, that line is very important to keep in mind. Speaking of lines, in the case of line attacks, specifically ones that are 5 feet across, rules as written, this can get complicated again. All creatures, besides the first one, in a straight 5 foot across line should probably have some level of cover with the rules as written. For instance, if Lightning Bolt is cast and 2 people are in the straight line in front of it, the second one would likely have half cover and thus get a +2 bonus on their dex save. I would use this ruling typically, but just be mindful of the relative size of those creatures, and there is an argument to be made that you could not want to use this with spells like Lightning Bolt due to the nature of lightning or the already large power gap between spells like Fireball and Lightning Bolt. I could see a train of thought for both. I would say use this for all spells, including Lightning Bolt, and that means that each creature beyond the first would probably get that +2 bonus on their dex save. However, you have to use this same logic, to be fair, on all spells, meaning that if a Fireball origination point kind of has to go through one creature to get to another creature behind them, then you should keep that in mind and give that creature a +2 bonus on their save as well. Kind of avoid making Lightning Bolt even weaker than it already is to Fireball. And as a last note, if a creature has full cover from an AoE, they should be fully safe from it, meaning no save, no damage. I think that there's a lot of thought that, like, if a fiery breath weapon is blowing through an area, it'll wrap around a pillar and hit everybody in the area. But if a player is super thoughtful and really tucks up into that to avoid it, I would totally let them get away with not having to make that save. Moving on to some DM advice, use cover regularly in fights. If you have an intelligent monster, have them move in formations with their allies. That allows for the more important of the monsters to use their lackeys for cover. Or have an intelligent ranged enemy make ample use of the natural cover around them to gain bonuses and be harder to hit. You should also, by extension though, expect your players to use these tactics against your monsters, and you should avoid fights that can be completely trounced by such tactics. However, do not punish good tactical thinking by your players. Allow the tanky character trying to impose themselves to grant that AC bonus, if they do it thoughtfully and position themselves intelligently. And allow your ranged characters to make use of high ground and arrow slits and cover to give themselves an advantage in an ensuing fight. If they're thoughtful in their tactics, they should be rewarded for that. You shouldn't get offended that it's going to be easier than you initially planned for. And as a player, use this regularly. Seek cover from big breath weapons and spells, impose yourself between your weaker allies and a ranged enemy, or simply make sure you think before dropping those big AoEs in the middle of a sea of enemies, that maybe if I do it a little closer or a little further away, there won't be as many enemies in the way of other enemies, granting them these bonuses. As a last note on cover, you can also just kinda choose to do away with it. I wouldn't recommend doing this. I think it's neat and it's cool and it adds extra complexity and thought to combat. but it also adds that additional complexity and thought to combat. And if you already feel overly bogged down by the rules, you can kind of just avoid using cover altogether, and the rules should function pretty well. Kind of just take the 1/2 and 3/4 cover out and just use total cover or no cover. This will make for less complex fights and is not my preferred way of playing the game myself, but is totally valid if your group is less into that tactical combat mindset. And in line with this, that optional hitting cover rule is awesome, and it adds some really cool complexity, but I would only use that if you are willing to do that pretty large amount of extra bookkeeping. It seems like a simple enough thing to add, but it will really kind of bog down combats a little bit more, and will require a lot of extra thought in terms of that extra little bit of math to be like, I missed, but I only missed by 1, and I missed by 1 because they have cover. Now I'm hitting the creature that was in the way providing them cover. What's its AC? Would my original attack have hit that? It's a lot of additional math and thought, and it requires you to be a lot more on it, both as the player and the game master. If you're willing to do that extra bit of work, I think it's worth it and adds some really cool interactions, but just know going into it that that extra level of thought is going to have to go into it. Closing thoughts, I think that cover is cool. I think that it really lends itself to tactical gameplay, and if you're someone who enjoys approaching fights intelligently, both as a DM and as a player, and having that matter and having positioning matter, then you should really lean into cover and take full advantage on both sides of the combat of all the cool effects it can have. It can also be really cool cinematically when you have things like dragon breath weapons blowing across an area of pillars, and the players who are smart enough to superimpose that pillar between them and it getting a bonus or avoiding it altogether. Use cover unless you're somebody who wants combats to be quick and you don't want extra things to keep track of, in which case you can do without it. And that has been the rules for cover in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. I hope you found that useful. If you did, please think about giving a like to the video or a comment. If you're interested in this kind of content, please check out the Downtime Activities YouTube channel. We've got all sorts of stuff like this, rules breakdowns, RPG discussions, reviews, gameplay, all that kind of stuff, so please give it a look. Now go forth, slay dragons, sling spells, roll dice, and enjoy your Downtime Activities.